Las Vegas, August 1961. A roulette wheel is already turning, the way it has been turning all night, the way it never really stops. Near the walls stand men in suits who watch the floor with a patience that makes everyone else uneasy. At one of the wheels, a middle-aged man seems to be doing nothing at all. He isn't drunk, he isn't loud, he isn't dressed like a hustler or trying to look lucky. He just stands close to the wheel and writes numbers in a small pad, the same way 1,000 hopeful gamblers have done before him, chasing a system that doesn't exist. A little further down the table, a younger man places small bets and pays almost no attention to the wheel. The two never speak. They never look at each other. And that is the entire point. Because under the first man's clothes is a computer the size of a cigarette pack. In his shoes are switches he works with his toes. Running up the second man's body, hidden against the skin, is a thin wire that ends in a tiny speaker pushed into his ear. And passing silently between them is a string of musical tones, a private language that should not be possible in 1961, in this room, on this floor. The first man is Claude Shannon. By this point, he's already one of the most important scientists who has ever lived. The man whose ideas sit underneath nearly everything we now call digital. The second is Edward Thorp, a young mathematician who has quietly worked out how to beat blackjack and is about to do something casinos will find far more disturbing. Together, the two of them are trying to prove a single dangerous idea, that roulette isn't really a game of luck, it's a machine governed by physics, and that anything governed by physics can be measured, and of course, beaten. For a few minutes, the whole thing works. The wheel spins. Shannon watches the ball circle the rim, and at the right moment, his toe presses down inside his shoe. A signal moves through the hidden machine, crosses the room, and reaches Thorpe as a coded tone in his ear. He slides chips onto the felt. The ball slows, drops from the rim, bounces through the pockets, and lands close enough. Then, it happens again, and again. A small pile of chips begins to grow in front of him, not enough to make them rich, but enough to prove something far more dangerous. The computer hidden under their clothes is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is turning the most random-looking game in the casino into something that can be measured. But to understand why Claude Shannon ended up in Las Vegas with wires running along his body, you have to go back to the kind of mind that could not leave anything alone. A mind that had already helped build the future and still somehow needed a harder problem. Years before Vegas, Shannon had shown that electrical circuits could be made to carry out logic, the basic insight that lets a machine reason in ones and zeros. Then, he built information theory, the mathematics of how messages move, how they can be measured, squeezed down, sent across a noisy line, and put back together at the far end without falling apart. Decades later, that work would be sitting silently inside computers, phone networks, the internet, and the early bones of artificial intelligence. He was, by any reasonable measure, finished. He had already done the thing most scientists would trade their careers for, which was part of the problem. By 1960, Shannon was at MIT, respected, secure, free to think about almost anything, and bored. The future he could see in his head was arriving too slowly. Computers existed, but they were prisoners. They filled entire rooms, ran on the schedules of universities and governments, and sat behind locked doors where ordinary people never touched them. To most of the world, a computer was a distant, humming cabinet you were not allowed near. Shannon never thought about machines that way. To him, a machine wasn't impressive because it was large. It was impressive if it was clever. His house near the majestic lakes was half home, half workshop, the basement full of motors and gears and switches and odd half-finished contraptions. Some of it was serious. A lot of it was a joke with a straight face. He once built a machine whose only function was to switch itself off after you turned it on. He juggled. He rode a unicycle down the MIT hallways. He never saw a clean line between play and science. A toy could hide a serious idea, and that was the whole fun of it. So when Edward Thorp turned up with a question that sounded at first almost childish, Shannon was exactly the wrong person to dismiss it. The question was this: could science beat gambling? Not on paper, not as an equation in a journal, inside a real casino with real money on the table, against people who did not lose gracefully. Thorp was younger than Shannon, but he had the same affliction. He could not leave a system alone. If a game had rules, he wanted to know exactly where those rules bent. If a casino swore it held the advantage, he wanted to know whether that advantage was actually permanent or just unexamined. He had already been picking at blackjack, a game most people treated as pure luck. Thorp saw something else in it, because cards are not like dice. Cards have a memory. Every card that gets played changes what is left in the deck, and if what's left changes, the odds change with it. That single observation would eventually become card counting, and a book that made the casinos of Nevada genuinely nervous. But before blackjack made his name, roulette had already lodged itself in his head, precisely because it looked so clean. A wheel, a ball, a dealer, a spin. No memory, no decisions, no deck to track. The casino sold roulette as chance in its purest form, and that was its genius. Thorp looked at the same table and refused to see fate. He saw an object. A ball runs around the rim and loses speed to friction. Gravity tugs it inward. The wheel turns beneath it. Sooner or later, the ball gives up the track and tumbles down toward the pockets. To the gambler holding his breath, that drop is destiny. To a physicist, it's just motion, and motion is something you can study. His idea was simple to say and miserable to build. If you could measure how fast the wheel was turning and how fast the ball was moving once a spin was already underway, you might be able to predict not the exact number, but the rough region of the wheel where the ball was likely to come to rest. Nobody needed the exact pocket. They only needed to know which slice of the wheel to favor. Because in a casino, even a small, genuine edge, repeated spin after spin, turns into a mountain. Roulette wasn't unbeatable. It was just happening faster than a human brain could follow, which meant the answer was a computer. And in 1961, that was a serious problem, because computers did not fit in shoes. They filled rooms. They had cabinets and cables and operators and budgets. You could not carry one quietly past a pit boss. So the two of them had to make something much, much smaller. They bought a regulation roulette wheel and set it up in Shannon's basement. And there, the game lost all its theater. No music, no smoke, no velvet, no dealer. Just a wheel and a ball and a clock and two grown men timing spins over and over. It slowed in a way that repeated. The wheel turned beneath it in a way that repeated. The final bounce was still messy and noisy, but they did not need the final bounce. They needed a sector, a neighborhood of numbers where the ball was more likely to settle than anywhere else. That gap was the entire project. In American roulette, the house grinds out its profit from the 0 and the 00. It never has to win every spin. It just needs a thin edge run thousands of times. Shannon and Thorp wanted to flip that logic around, not by guessing, but by measuring. The machine they ended up with was about the size of a pack of cigarettes and ran on 12 transistors. The person wearing it worked with microswitches built into the toes of his shoes. One toe to start the computer, the other to mark the moment the ball and the wheel passed a fixed point. The device did the timing, worked out which eighth of the wheel, which octant, the ball was most likely to favor, and then told the bettor what it had decided. It did not say anything out loud. That would have been suicidal. It spoke in tones. A little run of musical notes fed through that hidden wire into the speaker in the bettor's ear. One man stood by the wheel and watched. The other drifted down the table and placed the chips. To anyone else, they were two strangers at the same game. The watcher could scribble numbers and look like one more harmless system player. The kind of fool, as Thorp put it, that casinos see constantly and never worry about. The bettor could sit where he plainly wasn't even following the ball, which made him look unconnected to anything. On the surface, two ordinary men. Underneath, one machine split across two bodies. By June of 1961, it worked in the basement. and the numbers were almost hard to believe. Betting the favored octant, the device gave its wearer an expected edge of around 44%. The house edge hadn't just been erased, it had been turned inside out. One question was left. Could the thing survive Las Vegas? At first, the trip didn't feel like a heist. Shannon brought his wife, Betty. Thorp brought his wife, Vivian. There were hotel rooms and dinners and the strange doubled feeling of a vacation with something serious sewn into its lining. But underneath the holiday, everyone understood what they were doing. The casino was not MIT. In the basement, failure meant bad data. Here, failure could mean being caught wearing a concealed machine in a gambling house run, in those years, by people with deep ties to organized crime. People who did not have a sense of humor about clever experiments. The two men weren't robbing anyone. They weren't threatening anyone. They had built nothing but a measuring instrument. And yet, they were walking into a building whose entire existence depended on control, carrying a device designed to quietly take that control away. Casinos could live with lucky players, drunk players, superstitious players. What they could not live with was someone who could prove the game had a crack in it. On the floor, the two split up and behaved like men who had never met. Shannon usually took the wheel, timing the spin through the switch in his shoe and scribbling numbers on a pad for cover. Just another sad system player burning his evening on a pattern that wasn't there. Thorp took a seat further down the layout, near the chips, looking like he barely cared where the ball went. He waited for the tones. When they came, he bet. They kept the stakes tiny on purpose, 10-cent chips, small enough that nobody would look twice, small enough that even a win wouldn't trip an alarm. Getting rich was never the goal. Proving the machine worked outside the basement was. And it did. When the computer was running cleanly, the ball landed in the predicted region often enough to bend the whole game in their favor. A few dimes became a small pile, then another. For a few minutes at a time, the future of computing was sitting under their shirts, not being unveiled at a conference or pitched to investors, but hiding on a casino floor, whispering roulette predictions into a man's ear. The weak point was never the math. It wasn't the physics and it wasn't the wheel. It was the body. Heat, sweat, movement, clothing, all the small, ugly variables that never show up in a basement. The wires had to be thin enough to disappear against the skin, and being that thin made them fragile. They ran along the body, hidden as carefully as two men could manage, and the casino was warm and the tension never let up. Every glance from the dealer felt like the start of a question. Every win made them a little more visible. The system would work beautifully, then quietly die. So they'd retreat to the room, repair it, and come back. It would run, then break again. That became the actual rhythm of the trip. Not some smooth assault on the house, but a nervous loop of success, failure, repair, return. And each time they walked back to the table, they knew two things a little better than before. The device could win, and the device could give them away. The wives saw the room differently than the men did. Shannon and Thorp were locked onto the experiment. Betty and Vivian were watching for danger. Were the dealers starting to notice? Was anyone by the wall paying too much attention? How long could two university men keep pretending they belonged in a place that earned its living by reading people for a living? The longer they stayed, the worse the odds of getting away clean. Winning draws eyes. Winning with anything that looks like a pattern draws more. And even with tiny bets, the choreography around the table wasn't quite normal. They had come to prove a point, and the point was now proven. The sensible move was to walk. But experiments have their own gravity. Once a thing works, the pull is never to stop. It's to see how far it will go. Then came the moment that nearly ended it all. Thorp was sitting near a woman at the table when she turned and looked at him, not with idle curiosity, but with something closer to alarm. Her eyes had snagged on his ear. The little speaker had worked its way loose and slipped out of place, and a piece of the hidden machine was now visible, poking out where nothing like it should be. He later described it as the speaker peering out of his ear canal like some kind of insect. For a second, everything they had built hung on what this stranger decided to do next. She could call the dealer. She could point. She could ask out loud what that was. Any of it would have brought the one thing they could not survive, which was attention. Thorp got up and left the table, not running, not visibly panicking, just fast enough to be gone the moment turned into a scene. In the restroom, the problem was obvious and almost insulting in its smallness. The wire was loose. The speaker had shifted. The whole apparatus, the thing they had spent months perfecting, was failing for the dumbest possible reason. Not because the math was wrong, not because the wheel had beaten them, but because a hair-thin wire could not take the heat and sweat and motion of a real human being on a real casino floor. That was the warning, and they had been lucky to get it cheap. Not lucky at roulette, lucky not to be caught. Shannon, who understood better than anyone how short the distance was between two strangers in a connected world, had drilled the need for total secrecy into Thorp from the start. The gap between them and a furious casino owner was thinner than it felt. By the last session, the holiday mood was gone. The lights seemed too bright, the air too heavy, the dealers too close, and the men along the wall had stopped looking like background. Shannon took his place. Thorp took his. Betty and Vivian watched. The wheel spun, and to everyone else in the room, it was just one more spin. To Shannon, it was data. To Thorp, it was a tone that hadn't arrived yet. The toe pressed the switch. The timing ran through the device. The notes reached the ear. Thorp put down his bet, and the ball began to slow. This was the quiet strangeness at the heart of the whole thing. For centuries, roulette had been sold as a mystery. The spinning wheel, the rattling ball, the held breath, the final pocket where everyone's luck supposedly lived. Shannon and Thorp had cracked that mystery open. Not all the way, not perfectly, but far enough to see the gears turning inside it. The ball came off the track, hit the wheel, bounced, scattered across the pockets, and settled. Close enough. The prediction had worked again. And that was all they needed. They never became millionaires. They never walked out with sacks of money or break the house in a way that gamblers fantasize about. But they had done something stranger and, in the long run, much bigger. They had taken a computer out of its locked room and put it on a human body. They had turned a person into part of a machine that could watch the real world, do the math in real time, and feed back instructions through sound. Then, they had tested it in about the most hostile place imaginable, and it had held. After Vegas, they didn't build a gambling empire out of it. Part of that was simple distance. Thorp eventually left MIT. Their lives pulled in different directions. Part of it was the risk they had now felt firsthand. To run the device seriously, they'd have needed sturdier hardware, better concealment, and far more time inside casinos. And they had seen exactly how thin the margin was. A wire slipping, a stranger noticing, a dealer's gaze lingering a beat too long. So, they kept the machine, and the fact that it had ever existed, a secret. They said nothing publicly until 1966, and the full story took even longer to surface. By the time it did, the world had quietly moved toward them. Computers were shrinking, electronics were getting personal. A machine worn on the body no longer sounded like science fiction. But in 1961, long before smartwatches, before wireless earbuds, before fitness bands and step counters and glasses that put a screen in front of your eye, two men had already built the core of the idea. A computer that moved with a person, took in the real world as it happened, did its thinking instantly, and answered through a private sound in the ear. The first wearable computer wasn't born in a corporate lab. It came out of curiosity and boredom and a roulette wheel and two men who refused to accept that luck was the whole story. Shannon went back to being one of the defining minds of the information age, and his reputation never needed the roulette machine. He had already remade the world once. But the device says something true about him anyway. He didn't only think in theories. He needed ideas to move, to click, to spin, to become physical things you could hold and break and fix. Thorp went the other way. Blackjack made him famous. And from there, he walked into finance, where the casino was no longer a building in Nevada, but the whole of Wall Street. The same mind that had stared down cards and wheels went looking for hidden edges in markets and found them. That's the thread running through all of it. Thorp was never really a gambler. He was a student of unfair systems. Casinos told the public it was playing against chance. Markets told the public that prices were efficient and fair. In both places, Thorp simply looked closer, hunting for the spot where the numbers didn't match the story, and when he found the gap, he stepped into it. Other people came later and built their own roulette computers, some of them frighteningly effective. The casinos pushed back, and eventually so did the law. In 1985, Nevada banned the use of devices to predict or analyze the outcome of a game, which is, in a roundabout way, a monument to the things Shannon and Thorp had quietly proved decades earlier. But the larger idea had escaped the casino long before that. Today, people wear computers without giving it a thought, on their wrists, in their ears, against their skin, across their eyes. The devices count heartbeats and footsteps and hours of sleep, track where we are and what we're looking at, turn the world into data, chew on it, and send signals back to the body. That future didn't begin with a clean product launch. It began with two men standing apart at a roulette table, pretending not to know each other. One watching the wheel, one waiting for a tone, both quietly praying the wire would hold. A casino runs on a single promise, that the game is bigger than the player, that the wheel is too fast and the odds too deep to beat. Most people accept it. Shannon and Thorp didn't. They looked at roulette and saw what almost everyone around them had missed, that under the lights and the smoke and the ritual, it was still just a physical object with speed and friction and timing, and therefore with a weakness. For one strung-out week in Las Vegas, two academics carried a hidden computer onto the floor and made the most famous symbol of luck in the world answer, for a few spins, to mathematics. They never broke the bank, they never got rich, but they broke something more durable than either: the idea that the machine could only ever belong to the house. Because the real invention was never a way to predict roulette. It was a world where computers stopped living behind walls and started following us around, listening, guiding, until they became so ordinary that nobody remembers how strange the beginning was. A device the size of a cigarette pack, a wire taped to the skin, a tone in the ear, a spinning wheel, and two men who walked into Las Vegas not to trust luck, but to measure it.